1987, and somewhere in Rodeo, California, a 59-year-old man was stricken with fear inside a trailer home, surrounded by at least a dozen policemen, rushing to fit into a bulletproof vest as they hurriedly prepared to escort him out of town. The man's name was Lawrence Singleton, and he was an ex-convict whom the government was desperately trying to resettle. But the community wasn't having any of it. In fact, there was a mob coming for him. Mothers, fathers, and vigilant neighbors who wouldn't resist until Lawrence Singleton was as far away from the community as the West was from the East. Hell, some of the richer inhabitants were ready to bankroll a one-way trip to Cuba or Congo for Mr. Singleton. They would only feel safe if he was removed permanently from the continent. And if he decided he wouldn't leave, some people were more than ready to send Mr. Singleton back to his maker in the most violent way possible. This was how much Lawrence Singleton had come to be hated in 1988. So, the question we should be asking is, who was he? What had he done to become so reviled and despised? How was he able to incite that level of violence from regular, mostly peaceful folks? In other words, what were the good people of Rodeo, California really afraid of? Welcome back to Twisted Minds. My name is James, and today we are going to deep dive into the sickening inhumanity of Lawrence Singleton and the miraculous, almost unbelievable survival of Mary Vincent. Our story today begins with a young Mary Vincent, whose unfortunate encounter with Lawrence Singleton served as the catalyst for the overwhelming infamy tied to his name today. One of 7 children, Mary Vincent was born in 1963 to strict parents. Her father worked as a mechanic at their home in Las Vegas, and her mother juggled a military career and a side hustle as a professional blackjack dealer.
Just call me Brown Trending, bro.
She had a generic yet conflicting life. On one hand, she was into competitive dancing and wanted to explore the world as a performer. On the other hand, her parents' marriage was on the brink of collapse. And like many teenagers in her shoes, the meltdown of her parents' relationship was quickly stirring a rebellion within her. It started gradually. She would cut classes on some occasions, and on some others, she would skip school altogether. Eventually, she was just 15 when she ran away from her parents' home to live with an older boyfriend in Sausalito, California. However, her boyfriend would soon get into some serious trouble. He was accused of assaulting another girl and was promptly arrested, which caused Mary Vincent to return to Vegas. But she didn't go back home to her parents. She wandered a bit, sleeping in unlocked cars at night and hustling free meals during the day. Eventually, she decided to travel to her grandparents' home. They lived in Corona, California, quite the distance from where she was, but Mary was lost and she desperately needed stability in her life. She promised herself she would work hard at becoming a professional dancer once she was settled. Wild as it may seem in our time, it was common practice for teenagers to hitchhike a ride from complete and hopefully friendly strangers, a concept that we now frown on because of the long history of unfortunate events that the practice has led to. But the year was 1978. The hippie movement might have been dying, but the spirit was still very much alive. And what was the alternative? To go back home to a broken family? That wasn't an option for Mary Vincent. So, on the 29th of September, 1978, she walked a freeway, holding up a sign that read, "Heading south." But she wasn't alone. There were 2 other hitchhikers behind her, headed in a similar direction. After a couple hours of standing, a blue van pulled over, and sitting behind the wheel was 50-year-old Lawrence Bernard Singleton. This was 10 years before the Rodeo incident. He was 50 at the time, and to Mary Vincent, he looked like someone's harmless grandpa. At this point, I should be telling you some details about Lawrence Singleton's past. A backstory, a brief biography, turbulent childhood, something? Unfortunately, we know very little about this man's past. We know that he was a sea merchant, a native of Tampa, Florida, and that his only sibling, a man named Walter, had distanced himself and wouldn't breathe a word about his brother's existence. However, the world was about to learn more from Lawrence's future than his past could ever tell. When Lawrence Singleton pulled up in front of the 3 hitchhikers, he handpicked Mary Vincent as the only one whom he would be willing to give a ride. To the other hitchhikers, this was odd. A 50-year-old stranger who was alone in a van didn't bid good tidings. To make matters more suspicious, all three of them were headed south, in the same direction, and there was more than enough space for all of them. So it made very little sense that Lawrence was refusing to carry all three of them. But you know how someone can be so tied up that their brain cops out and makes poor decisions by default? Well, that was exactly what happened to Mary Vincent. Despite the warnings from the other two hitchhikers, she accepted Lawrence Singleton's offer. She had been on the road for a little too long. She had spent enough nights in other people's cars, and she hadn't properly processed all of the emotional baggage that had hit her over the last couple of days. She was young and she was trusting. Everything was in place for her to make a bad decision.
USAA is made for the safe pilots, like Sergeant Hayden, who won't return a call until the engine's cool.
Now, Lawrence Singleton wasn't exactly headed in her direction, but he offered to turn around at a certain point for her. She was glad. Another gesture of goodwill. When she had settled into the vehicle and they were well on their way, Mary pulled out a cigarette and was about to take a puff when she sneezed. Then, the man reached over, touched her back, and pulled her to himself, saying, "Let's see if you're sick." Immediately, Mary got defensive, and rightfully so.
That's weird.
Why would he, a stranger whom she had just met, feel comfortable enough to touch her? So, she withdrew from his grasp, leaned back, and Lawrence turned his attention back to the road. Some moments later, Mary fell asleep. By the time she woke up, she noticed the signs on the road were all wrong. They were headed in the wrong direction. All of her instincts kicked in, and she picked up a stick that was lying on the car floor, pointed it to Lawrence, and insisted that he turn the car around. She told him that he knew what he was doing. Lawrence Singleton shrugged it off as a simple mistake.
Why can't I move that?
However, he told her he wanted to take a leap.
Jesus.
So he drove off-road, parked, and got out of the vehicle. Left alone in the vehicle with just her thoughts, Mary Vincent began to soak in the danger of her situation. She knew she was in trouble. However, to her, the man looked old and unhealthy. She felt that she could easily overpower or outrun him. Then she realized that her shoelaces were untied. So, when she came down from the vehicle, she bent to do her laces. And Lawrence Singleton hit her with a sledgehammer to the back of her head.
Jesus.
Knocking her out cold. By the time Mary would regain consciousness, she was naked and tied up in the back of his van in such a way that she wouldn't be able to move, even if she tried. He drove down toward a canyon, and when they were secluded enough, he began to assault her. Through a harrowing night, this vile man repeated the assault about 6 times. At some point, Mary Vincent just wanted to die. It was unbearable for her. She kept asking him, why, but got no response. And when he was done and the sun was beginning to rise, she begged him, "Set me free." So he cut her loose, pulled her out of the van, and then he taunted her with these words, "You want to be set free? I'll set you free." He pulled out a hatchet from his toolbox, took her left arm, and swung at it. Immediately, Mary grabbed at his arm. Too much was happening at once. She was in shock. She did not realize what this monster was doing. He took another swing at her left arm, and she began to fall. Her hand came off her body, but it was firmly gripping Lawrence Singleton's arm. It wasn't until she looked at her own hand that she realized what had happened. So she began thrashing, screaming, hoping that someone would hear her.
What?
But this diabolical man wasn't done. He reached for her right hand and hacked at it repeatedly until it came off. The horror of what had just happened to her was intense, and her body went into shock. And the last thing she said she could remember as she faded was Lawrence trying to pry off her dismembered left hand that was still gripping tightly to his hand. And somehow, this monster still wasn't done. After this, he dragged what he must have thought was a lifeless body to a cliff and threw her down to her death before stuffing her into a culvert. Anyone would have died. In fact, there are countless who have suffered fewer horrors and not made it. But somehow, within Mary Vincent's core, her will wouldn't let her go. They say when people are at their lowest, most desperate point, that is when you know their true nature. For Mary Vincent, who was in the ditch slowly bleeding to death, her mind raced and pondered over one thought. If you die here, this man will try to do this to another girl. Mary wasn't thinking about herself when the adrenaline took over. She was thinking about other girls like her. So she mustered strength from every fiber of her being and pulled herself up. Her arms were bleeding buckets, so she resourcefully dug both severed arms into the mud to reduce the bleeding and climbed out. She walked until she could hear the sound of vehicles zooming across the highway. Eventually, she got to the road, and the first vehicle that saw her was a red sports car with 2 guys in it, but they got scared and drove off. She didn't blame them. No one could. She was armless, covered in blood, actively bleeding, and completely naked. It wasn't a sight for the faint-hearted. Eventually, a couple on their way to their vacation saw her and, without asking questions, wrapped her in a towel and took her to the hospital. When they would eventually ask her, all she could say was, "He raped me." She was taken into surgery immediately.
That's
and given
fucking
prosthetic arms.
insane.
When the police arrived, they questioned her about the terrible attack, but the trauma had eaten deep. They had to use forensic hypnosis to get Mary to give them a detailed account of the events surrounding her attack and a detailed description of the mutilator who attacked her. It worked. One of her severed limbs was later found near the Golden Gate Bridge, and the sketch of her attacker circulated the media until a California man recognized the killer as his neighbor, Lawrence Singleton. He was promptly arrested, and 11 days after the attack, Mary was able to confirm that he was indeed her attacker.
Wow.
Between his capture and trial, Lawrence Singleton garnered serious infamy. The story was too gory. How could anyone be so depraved? That was the question everyone was asking. It was beyond surreal. The media began to call Lawrence Singleton the Mad Chopper. 5 months after the incident, the trial of the Mad Chopper would begin. In court, Mary Vincent had to sit through the painful proceedings of the trial. She was only 10 to 15 feet away from the monster, and anytime she had to take the stand, she would have to walk in front of him. During one of those times, he whispered something that shook her to her core. He said, "If it's the last thing I do, I will finish the job." When Lawrence Singleton took the stand, he told so many incongruent lies. He said Mary Vincent was a $10 an hour prostitute and that she had tried to maim him. He also spoke about the 2 other hitchhikers, saying that they were in on it. He maintained his innocence. In his delusional skull, he wasn't the one who committed the crime. But his lies were pointless. They didn't add up.
Fucking
The
insane.
jury
Forgot.
couldn't believe him.
You were
They
streaming,
could
my
not.
bad. No, you're fine.
Not when Mary
I just
Vincent
texted you
was both
back.
a key witness and living
I
evidence.
just keep forgetting I have a
Eventually, he was
phone.
found
Barbara
guilty
texted
and
me like
sentenced to
30 minutes
14
ago and I
years
never
behind bars,
replied.
which was the maximum he could legally be served. At
This
the
guy
time,
cut off this
judges
woman's
were allowed to
arms.
impose consecutive sentences for
And she
each
lived.
felony. So the most Singleton could get was 14 years and 4 months. If Singleton had been sentenced today for the charges he was convicted of in the 1978 case, he would have drawn multiple 25-year to life sentences. And a judge could have stacked the sentences for each conviction instead of letting Singleton serve them simultaneously. Singleton would not have been eligible for parole until he had served 49 years, which is more than 6 times as long as he spent behind bars. Even the judge was distressed and publicly stated that if he could, he would have ensured that Singleton spent the rest of his miserable life locked up. Mary and the public were understandably upset over the sentence, deeming it too short and unjust. This would lead to the passing of the Singleton Bill in California, which ceases the early release of criminals who used torture in their crime and allowed for 25 to life sentences as well. However, while the law got tougher, Singleton got the easier end of the stick. Throughout the time he was in jail, Mary was terrified. At home, she was having trouble with her family and felt isolated at her specialized school for the handicapped. Her dreams of becoming a dancer were dashed. She moved away as soon as she graduated and became secretive about her life and location.
Understandable.
Traumatized and depressed, Vincent became anorexic, had trouble leaving the house, and saw many of her close relationships.
This is Conqueror's Blade. Create a warlord, your own personal hero. You can customize them to
She ended up living in fear for years. All the while Mary lived in agony, San Quentin released Lawrence Singleton on parole after serving only 8 years and 4 months because, in their words, he had been a model prisoner. He became a teacher's aide in prison and stayed away from trouble. For them, this was enough to let a mutilator off easy. The public expressed massive outrage against this act of leniency. The unremorseful prisoner was still maintaining his innocence. Just before his release, his psychiatrist stated the following: "Because he is so out of touch with his hostility and anger, he remains an elevated threat to others' safety inside and outside prison." After this evaluation, he was let loose. However, if Lawrence Singleton thought he had escaped proper judgment from the justice system, he was about to receive a wake-up call from the people. No town wanted the monster in their city. Lawrence Singleton went on a parole odyssey. In April 1987, the people of Antioch, Contra Costa County learned that their town had been chosen for Singleton's parole. More than 10,000 people signed a petition that blocked the state's attempt. Meanwhile, both Nevada and his home state of Florida rejected him. So the state of California chose Martinez as the county where Singleton would serve his parole. On the 24th of that same month, and a day before he was released, Martinez city council officers obtained restraining orders that would block Singleton from settling anywhere in their county. The next day, Singleton, 59, was released from California Men's Colony at San Luis Obispo and had to spend some time heavily guarded in a secret location in San Francisco. 3 days later, officials in San Francisco caught wind of it and obtained a restraining order barring him. Reporters found him in a hotel in Redwood City, and he had to be whisked away. Over the next month, county officials of Contra Costa actively thwarted the state's covert attempts at keeping him amongst them. When they moved him to Richmond, the mayor publicly denounced Singleton and joined demonstrations to force him out. Eventually, he found himself in the town of Rodeo, where several hundred angry people protested outside his apartment. Some people were prepared to lynch the man if the state insisted on keeping him in their town. When the pressure reached a fever pitch, the governor of California at the time, George Duke Majian, announced that Singleton would serve the remainder of his parole in a trailer on the grounds of San Quentin Prison. Lawrence Singleton joined Alcoholics Anonymous and claimed he was sober. Meanwhile, Mary Vinson remained in hiding. Singleton felt as though he was the victim in the attack against Mary Vinson and decided
What the
to sue
fuck?
her. He began telling anyone who would care to listen that while he was in jail, he considered the alleged events and determined that he was not guilty. He said he remembered Vinson threatening to accuse him of rape and that she brandished a stick at him. He decided that this was the reason he had become violent, maintaining mistreatment from the courts. He filed a complaint, suing Vinson for forcible kidnap for the purposes of robbery. Can you even begin to imagine the madness lurking between this monster's ears?
What
He
the
feigned
fuck?
sympathy for Vinson, claiming he almost vomited 3 times and that he could not sleep several nights after the act. However, this suit never gained traction, and the courts dismissed it. Soon, some details began to come to light in the aftermath of his early release. It turned out that Mary Vinson was not the only one who feared Singleton. He had a daughter, Deborah, who shared some details about the nature of her father. When she found out that he was getting out of jail, she also fled and hid, asking law enforcement if there was any way they could keep him behind bars for longer. Considering how he had just used his status as a father to lure Mary into his car, it only made sense to her. In her own words, "I asked California prison personnel what could be done to keep him in longer, and I was told there was nothing. They suggested I obtain a restraining order at the time of his release. Sorry, but I mean this quite sarcastically. I tell you he is a danger. I said that before the first crime, I've changed my name multiple times and am moving across state lines. And you all suggest a piece of paper that will tell him exactly where I am, what my name is, and not to come within 300 feet of me. However, he didn't go looking for his estranged daughter after his parole was over. He figured that he had no place in California, so he relocated to Florida. 3 years later, he was arrested for theft and sentenced to 2 years. Once again, he served only a fraction of the time. He continued with his petty theft, stealing small, inexpensive objects, and was relatively free until the 19th of February, 1997.
Another ad, bro.
Today, we're gonna be unboxing these headphones that I bought online. See, the thing is,
A local house painter was going about his business when he witnessed what he could only describe as a horrific scene. A naked man covered in blood was relentlessly stabbing a woman who lay motionless on the sofa. It was macabre and mindless. From where he stood, he could hear bones crunching with each stab. So he scrambled to call the police. And when they responded to the call and knocked on the door of this nude, bloodbath killer, it turned out to be Lawrence Singleton once again. 20 years after his first crime, the mad chopper had struck, but this time, unlike Mary Vincent, who survived, he finished the job. When the police got to the door of his apartment, Lawrence nonchalantly responded, still naked and still covered in blood. He had not attempted to clean himself up. When they asked him why he was covered in blood, he told them that he hurt his finger. And when they told him that they would like to question him, Lawrence excused himself, leaving the door half open. The lifeless body of his victim, Roxanne Hayes, was clearly in view, still on the couch. He had not even bothered to hide the body or his crime. This man wasn't even bothered about getting caught. His victim, Roxanne Hayes, a mother of 3 and an escort who did what she could to support her family, had agreed to meet him for $20. In court, Lawrence Singleton told the most brazen and bizarre account of events. It was as unbelievable as was remarkably dumb. He claimed that she tried to make more money than they agreed upon. They struggled, and she picked up a knife that he had kept on the living room table to chop vegetables while watching TV. The struggle lasted about 30 seconds, and each time he pulled Hayes' arm downward to pry the knife from her hand, according to him, she stabbed herself each time. But this bull story doesn't end there. He continued to say that he didn't realize she was injured until she lay dying on his sofa and asked him to hold her in his arms. Then he said she put both arms around him and they embraced. At that point, he said, he realized Hayes was injured and bleeding heavily. He wanted to call 911, but picked up the remote control instead. He then said that he told her they had to get to the hospital, but when he tried to help her walk out the door, his knees went out and they collapsed on the dining room floor. Then he sat there and cried and rubbed her face and tried to talk to her, but she didn't respond because she was dead. I can only imagine how the jurors must have felt with this story that feels like the plot of a grossly underfunded B-movie. Everyone was ready to finally and permanently put this man behind bars, and they had someone who would ensure the error of 20 years before wasn't repeated. Mary Vincent flew in from California to Florida to testify on behalf of Roxanne. She went into great detail about what had happened to her and gave them a vivid idea of the kind of monster he was. Justice would not be cheated again. After the trial was over, it took the jurors only 4 hours to come to a guilty verdict. On April 14th, 1998, Singleton was given a death sentence for the senseless and horrific murder of Roxanne Hayes. Unsurprisingly, Lawrence Singleton appeared to not care about the sentence. He eventually admitted that he killed her. On the 28th of December, while awaiting his execution, Lawrence Singleton died from cancer at the age of 74. In the aftermath of this man's despicable life, there have been questions. We know that no one wakes up to commit crimes of the nature that Singleton committed. Many have been wondering how many women he must have killed in the past whose death was never linked to him. How many victims are currently off the California freeway begging to be found? Victims that, unfortunately, didn't have the same luck or will that Mary Vincent possessed. So, what about Mary Vincent? How has she been since the death of Singleton? Well, no one can say she's been good. After the attack, her leg had to be used to reconstruct her arms. This reality ended her childhood dreams of dancing. Years after her recovery, Mary got married and divorced. Her trauma had caused her serious stress and depression. Eventually, she became a mother of 2 boys. From there, her life began to change for the better. She began to heal and establish close relationships as her new family became the source of her strength. Vincent also learned to paint, draw, and sketch. Art brought her immense joy, as well as a new direction for her life. Her works have sold for thousands of dollars since, and if you happen to meet her, you wouldn't see a trace of Lawrence Singleton's
It's
crime.
crazy.
She has succeeded in converting everything to strength. Thanks for tuning in to Twisted Mind.
Wild shit, dude.